and welcome to our final Lunch and Learn. Hold on one second, I want to make sure you're catching those, right? I should not catch those. Okay, great. Our final Lunch and Learn, celebrating FCRR's 20th anniversary, and I have the pleasure of hosting this one with two guests to talk to us about equitable implementation of evidence-based practices. I thought it would be helpful to give a little bit of insight as to why I thought, when given the opportunity to think about FCRR's past, present, and future, why this topic. So I'm sure you're all, as reading researchers, very much so familiar with NAEP scores associated with reading performance. And even upon joining FCRR, though it's always been true for most of my career, I've always been aware of NAEP scores, and I've always been aware of how poorly, on average, students in this country perform on this particular measure of reading in 4th and 8th grade. These are trends on scaled scores. The green lines represent what would be considered proficient. So we always, at least, or not, well, kind of always, but certainly since 1992, we have always been below this green line. And we haven't really changed that much. Sure, there are some significant differences over time, but in general, we've always sort of had this issue with getting lots of kids, enough kids reading and succeeding in school. This is particularly relevant for me because in 2002, when FCRR was founded, I was a special education teacher. Teaching kids, lots of kids who were having difficulty with all kinds of things associated with reading and writing and language. And so that's actually a picture of me when I was actually the president of the Black Graduate Student Association. And so that's the one picture I could find me for 2002 to put on this slide. Another important, and why it's important, I think, thinking over time for where we are now, we have this one unprecedented event of this COVID-19 pandemic that's coming up, as it turns out, right around our 20th anniversary. And the main difference you see is that we're going in the wrong direction. So not only are we below the line, but we're not going up, we're going down, right? So this happens to be a pretty interesting time to think about what is our charge in figuring out what to do about this issue and if we should do things differently. We talk a lot here about issues associated with translating all of the discovery, all of the knowledge, all the things we have learned over the last 20 years and translating that to something that can be used out there in the world to improve reading success in schools. I think the process of translating is complicated, and I think we learn more and more about it every year because it's not really our domain. There are actual other people who do that work and really study that work. It's not necessarily something that we have been experts in understanding. But we do get at a very basic level that in the work that we do, there are 3 problems we're trying to figure out. One is just whether or not we know if something is working. So often that means you're going to take a basic science approach to really figure out whether or not you've come up with some malleable construct that can be moved or changed based on what you do. And you may or may not do that with a targeted stakeholder group because oftentimes, and I think it's important to recognize that we don't want to waste people's time with things that we don't know that should help them. So we spend a lot of time trying to figure out those things on our own. But once we have something that we think is viable, we try to get people to make use of that. So we want the end user to use it. And one of our problems is figuring out how to get that one school, that one teacher, that one clinician to do the things that we think work. But the bigger problem, of course, is we don't just want one school. We don't participate in this enterprise of science to not get generalizable knowledge that can be used at scale. So we want more than just one school. We want every kid. But that's going to require us to do different kinds of research. That moves us into things of thinking about effectiveness and dissemination and implementation of these things we have learned in the real world. And it requires us to engage with our stakeholders in ways that might be different than we have before. So today we want to focus specifically on the issues of implementation. And I think personally that FCRR as an institution is well primed to take on this challenge. We can only play around in this space because of all that we know and all that we've done over the last 20 years. There are many, many, many things we don't know. There's lots of work to still do. For those of you who are students in this room, guaranteed a job. because there are always questions that will need to be answered that you will be well skilled to tackle, right? But I also think that there might be new questions to be asked and answered and new ways of thinking about how to do this work because of how far we've advanced in reading. And so what we're going to talk about today hopefully pushes us to think about how we might move in those different directions. As we do, I thought it would help to set the stage a little bit and talk about implementation and different ways to think about that. Our speakers are certainly going to talk about it. A few ways to think about it. One is thinking about implementation along a continuum when you're trying to spread and sustain evidence-based practices or innovations or tools, things you know that work, right? So diffusion is about passive spread. That's word of mouth. Use this curriculum, this tool, this strategy because my friend next door, my colleague uses it. It worked for them, so I'm going to use it too. It's very informal. You just let it happen. Dissemination is much more targeted distribution of information. That's when you're actually trying to help it happen, okay? We do a lot of that here at FCRR, in particular with Innovative Research Dissemination Lab. And some of our colleagues in this room are actually who are part of that team or here, do a lot of work in dissemination and through the dissemination work that they do, allow for diffusion to happen as well. And so we engage in those ways. We also do a lot around implementation, certainly from the very beginning with Reading First all the way up to now through the Regional Education Laboratory. We do implementation work that makes it happen, where you're actually using strategies to make the change happen. When you dig deeper into implementation, you will find that there are lots of frameworks out there that can be used to help us study facets associated with implementation. This is one framework, the active implementation framework. It's one that we've been looking at a lot in the work that we are doing in the REL, as well as the work that we're doing in our partnership with our local school district. The way to think about this is that in order to get a socially significant outcome, like 100% of students meeting grade level expectations in reading, you've got to consider the effective practice, effective implementation, and the context in which you're making that happen. So if you're thinking about effective practices, you're asking questions about the actual intervention. What's being implemented? What's the evidence of its effectiveness? How can it be adopted in different contexts? Those are questions that we spend a lot of time in the history of FCRR focusing on. And we have lots of projects, lots of logos. We fill up the page of logos, looking at the kinds of research that we have done that have focused on making sure we know that we actually have an effective evidence-based practice that could be used out there in the real world. But if you move into the implementation space, your questions change. And now you're focused on things like, how do you make implementation happen over time? And how does it change over time? What infrastructure is necessary to make that happen? What infrastructure is necessary to sustain it with fidelity? What's enough fidelity to get you the outcomes you want to see? How do you use data to communicate about these different changes and what is necessary? When you start to think about the context in which those things happen, your questions are about your stakeholders, how they're being engaged in this work, how they are changing, what those bidirectional interactions and relationships look like, and how you use that data to continue to sustain change. Those are very different kinds of questions that require very different types of methodologies that, quite frankly, we have to learn how to do or work with others who do. You also have to think about implementation for food. So I can put up NAEP scores and we can look at how many kids are struggling with reading. But these are NAEP scores for fourth graders in 2019, and it doesn't matter what year I put up here. Every single year I've shown you, I can put up here and look at different subgroups of students and you will see disparities. And certainly after COVID, we've got those disparities have widened and they've gotten worse. But the rates, when you look at the rates just associated with performance on the NAEP, what you will see is, first and foremost, importantly, about 1/3 of students are performing at proficient levels. So that's not good already, right? We're talking about 2/3 of kids in our schools are not performing at proficient levels. That's not great. But when you get down to looking at specific subgroups of students to find out who's actually really struggling with reading in schools, you find shocking rates, right? 1 in 5 Black kids, 1 in 5 students who are participating in free and reduced lunch programs, 1 in 10 students with disabilities are performing at proficient levels. These can't be okay. So if we're going to talk about implementation, we're going to study implementation, we really do have to seriously think about For who and under what conditions are we expecting these changes to happen? We have to start asking questions about what are the priorities for the research questions that we ask, and who came up with them, and who's at the table to talk about them, who decides what we focus on, who benefits from what we focus on. We do a lot of research on underrepresented groups, on underperforming kids to close achievement gaps, right? But how are we engaging those groups of people at the table when we think about actually moving the needle for those kids? Because if you move the needles for those kids, those proficiency rates go up. That's who it is that we need to focus on. So the big question is, if you're gonna figure out how to get to these equitable outcomes, you're gonna have to care about the processes and systems in which we expect to see equitable outcomes emerge. So you can't look at instruction and intervention in a bubble. You really have to think about the entire process that's there that is allowing for these outcomes to emerge. You've got to think beyond fidelity and adherence to think about things like adaptation, think about things like heterogeneity, how that matters for fit, how that matters for the outcomes. And that is not an easy thing to do. I don't think we have the answers to those questions. I think we need another 20 years or more to probably figure it out. But I think there are people out there in the world who can help us think it through. And so that's who I invited today to talk to us, one implementation researcher and one implementation practitioner. Implementation research, very simple definition for it, is a scientific study of methods that promote the systematic uptake of research findings into routine practice. Again, the goal is to produce generalizable knowledge. We're still talking about scientific empirical investigations. Dr. Anna Baumann, who is an assistant professor at Washington University at St. Louis, is going to talk to us about her work and her trajectory in that area. She is the co-director of the Dissemination and Implementation Research Core, which is a part of the Institute for Clinical and Translational Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. And then Dr. Kenyana Burke, who is with Excel and Ed, but formerly a classroom teacher and formerly with the Mississippi State Department of Education. And she has spent many years focused on how to get those evidence-based practices implemented in classrooms and even all the way up to state legislators. And so she's going to talk to us about that, because it's important to keep in mind if you're going to think about who you're implementing for and the context in which you're doing that. Not all implementers are alike. They don't have all the same needs. They don't have all the same perspectives. They don't have all the same desires, even though they say they want the same outcome. And she's had the fortunate opportunity, and there are lots of those different kinds of folks. So first we're going to bring up Anna. Anna, unfortunately, has the flu, and we thought it important to not bring her here with us while she was experiencing the flu. So I'm going to bring, she is here with us on Zoom right now. We're going to bring her up so that she can share with us.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, awesome. Hold on. All right, can you see the slides now?
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I really want to say thank you for this opportunity. As you can hear, I'm here to share hopefully just the knowledge, not the fires, because you don't want to get any of this. I do have a dog that might bark with me, so if you see me moving around, it's just me trying to get out. You have access to the PowerPoints, so I'm going to go really in a fast pace, because the goal really here is to have a conversation. When we talk about equity, there are many, many ways you can place equity conversations. And so I'm going to share just one way, one path to conceptualize equity in implementation science. And I apologize ahead of time. I have my water, I have my tea, so we're going to do this. Important information is that those slides have not been audited for visual disabilities. If you want an audited version, email me. I'm happy to add the caps and change the visual for the slides for you. If you do not know what audited slides for visual disability means, that is my first, and we were going to talk about it, little A, advocacy for equity, meaning we should all know what that means, and we should be equitable in our conversations, in our presentations. I'm a research faculty, so I get the privilege of working with many people. I want to recognize my funders, but I want to say that all the information is my own personal information. You will see here that I have my Twitter handle at the bottom of those slides. The rationale of the Twitter handle is really because a lot of us do advocacy in the Twitter space. We're still in the Twitter space. And we use those hashtags if you want to engage in the conversation, which I hope you do after this presentation. Okay, so when we talk about equity, it's really important for me to talk about my positionality, because the way my geography and my own work affects the way that I see and affects the way that I talk about equity. So I am Latina. I was born and raised in Brazil, dual citizen, able-bodied, white skin, colonizer, cisgender woman. And relevant to this conversation, I am a mom of 2 little kids who are learning how to write, how to read, how to engage with literacy. I do a lot of work in parent interventions in the US and globally for Latino families. And the work that I do as part of an implementation scientist is an intersection of implementation science, adaptation science, and health equity. So those spaces are the ones that affect the way that I see the work, the way that I ask the questions, and the way that I engage with implementation science. We're going to talk really fast about implementation science, and Nicole did a fantastic job priming some of those conversations, and then go through equity and implementation science and some thoughts for the future. So implementation science, this is a review. The Ballas and Duran is a review of a paper, and we've seen different states and different areas that it takes about 17 years for only a percentage of the clinical trials of the evidence-based interventions to be implemented in usual care. This is a paper in the context of sickle cell disease, which to me is one of the health disparities within the disparities, and it's very serious, especially in the context also in school settings. So I like this picture because it shows to me, and it reminds me that, for example, when I take my kids to their doctor, they might or may not be receiving the best quality of care that they need. Same for schools. 17 years is a long time. And so the field of implementation science was born to decrease the quality gap between what we could all be receiving, be it in hospitals and schools, versus what we are actually receiving. I'm going to go really fast to distinguish the difference between clinical trials, implementation trials, which I think then will be helpful to set up the conversation about equity. So in clinical trials, Nicole mentioned, right, you have an intervention and you ask what is the outcome of that intervention in terms of patients. So if you have an intervention, say I'm going to teach those kids to read, that your outcome is increasing reading, right? In this case, whether taking a drug X, decrease pain, or whatever that might be. The problem is how you implement, I'm going to take the dog outside. How you implement those interventions matter. For example, say that you're even training teachers to implement a reading program for kids. If you're training it online, would that be any difference if you train it in person? Or if you train it in 2 months versus 2 sessions? How would that process of training affect the way that the intervention is being delivered? Those are what we call the implementation strategies. And we know that they are mediators of the effectiveness of the interventions. Then you have what we call the implementation outcomes. You might have the best intervention, you might know how to train people, but if the intervention, for example, is too expensive, or if the teachers don't like it, or if the parents say, you're not doing this, things like feasibility, acceptability might affect the efficacy of the intervention. And then you have service outcomes. This is a little bit more related in terms of service healthcare. But I'm thinking, for example, Nicole urged us to think about the curve is going down, not up, right? Timing is of importance for us right now. Our kids should be getting better, and they're not, right? How efficient, how timeliness is important, how equitable are our interventions. And so all of this is affected by context. And the field of implementation science then was born to figure out how can we accelerate the uptake of evidence-based interventions so as to improve quality of care. And that's what we do. Usually we have D and I fields together. The dissemination is a whole nother bucket of information, and Nicole mentioned to that. There's a whole literature. I'm not going to talk about dissemination today. I'm going to talk about implementation. Okay, so as I mentioned, equity and implementation science, there are many ways to talk about this, right? There's in terms of methods, science, measures. I'm going to talk about how you can think about frameworks in implementation science with the context of equity. Why are frameworks important? And this is not necessarily a question just for the void. It's a question for you to think. Frameworks are important, theories are important because they inform your research question, and they inform your designs, and they inform your measures. And what happened in the field of implementation science is that traditionally those frameworks that we have many did not have equity or any constructs related to equity explicitly outlined and defined in their frameworks. And so the field, even though it was born to decrease equality of gap, did not have that equity space explicit. So several of us have been working on this field sorry, to push the field a little bit more forward and be more explicit and intentional about equity. Okay, pause, because I need to tell you what is not equity. When we have conversation about equity, it's also important to draw the line about not what is not equity. Equity is not an outcome. If you increase the line, improve the line of reading, that doesn't mean that you have achieved equity. Equity is not a checklist, meaning, oh, I have diverse students in my classroom, so now I have achieved equity. Equity is not diversity. And in fact, diversity does not necessarily mean equity. Equity is not that if you raise, I fail. It's not a pie. It's not a scarcity perspective. Equity is if I help your community, all of us will be helpful. So I'm assuming that you've seen this, the difference between inequality. Inequality is when you have, for example, a school that has more resources than other. Equality is when you give the same intervention to different schools, regardless of their settings. Equity is when you adapt and you improve and you change the intervention depending on the school setting. Justice, which I hope eventually we'll start talking about, is when each school and each student within that school receives what he or she or they deserve to achieve their best well-being. So this is a process. It's not an outcome, it's not a checklist. It's a process that entails a lot of thinking. You had those readings. And again, this is just the start of a conversation, right? And the whole point here is to infuse the field of implementation science in your thinking and the way that we implement interventions with an equity lens. We talked about frameworks and the importance of frameworks and how they inform our field. And this is important because theories and frameworks, they have assumptions. And often those assumptions are silent. There's a field, an entire field from psychology called cultural adaptation field which was born to adapt evidence-based interventions for historically underserved populations. And the assumption in that field was that once you adopted an intervention, the intervention then is going to be uptaked and then everybody's going to be happy, which is not true. There's this whole field called healthcare disparities field, which developed interventions to see if we can then address disparities, social determinants of health. Again, with some of the assumptions that once the interventions are developed, then everybody's going to be happy. And it's not true. And then you have the field of implementation science that was born to decrease the quality gap and said, okay, let's implement evidence-based interventions. But then they forgot that one size does not fit all. And so part of what an equitable approach to your research question and to your practice is to really sit down and making explicit the assumptions that you have in your work. So the implications are those assumptions affect how you select the theories, how you select your interventions, and how you engage with the communities. I apologize for the cough. So this is the framework that we, in the field of implementation sciences, a lot is by Enola Proctor et al., right, which talks about the what is intervention, the how you implement the interventions, implementation outcomes, service outcomes, and patient outcomes, and all of that affected then by context. And what Leo Cabas and I did was we brought that framework and extracted equity spaces within all of those using 5 core recommendations. One is to focus on the reach from the very beginning. You can shift your clinical trial in whatever body of this you have, mental health, cancer, any type of cancer, any type of research. The problem is that in clinical trials, our populations that need us the most are not present. And the problem with that is that then you have issues with measurement development, with intervention efficacy, intervention sustainability, meaning we're developing evidence-based interventions. They're evidence only for those who are present in clinical trials. Ditto for measurement. And so those kids who need us the most are not present in the clinical trials, informing what kind of interventions we need to really implement. So I urge you, all of us, to examine who is present, but most importantly, who is absent in your trials, on your studies, in your classrooms. Why? There's no population that's hard to reach. What is hard to reach is us being able to go to where people need us the most. Who is absent in your research network, in your personal network, and why? And how does that inform your questions in the way that you interact in the world? Reach is not just about the number of people in your trials and your studies, but it's about the settings, right? A lot of the implementation science studies, there's a journal called Implementation Science Journal. They are happening in hospital settings, in settings where we expect people to come to us. I would love for us to think more carefully about how we can then reach people where they are. There is a whole body of literature in thinking about how to engage and how to reach people. Issues of trust, issues of who is reaching, engaging with technology, engaging with community. There's a body of literature out there helping us think about how we can engage with our peers to really come and help us develop our interventions. So if you're having a hard time recruiting, think through what is it that you're not doing? Who is absent in your research team? And how can you be then creative to meet people where they are? Say that now you have a setting and you're designing and selecting interventions. The goal here really is, traditionally, in some settings, we've done a lot of designing interventions, meaning using the theory and the research team designing. What we've been asking more vocally is to engage with the community and to think through things about how adaptable is your intervention. Why is that important? That is important because if you design an intervention that is fitting for a high resource school, when you take that intervention to a low resource setting, it's not going to work. And so how adaptable is that intervention? How can you ensure that the fit of that intervention with different settings? But most importantly, whose voices are informing the development of those interventions? Because the goal here is to develop the interventions with, for, and in the community. Thinking ahead of time about the flexibility, about the cost, and the feasibility of that intervention. And there, again, tons of methodologies that you can use so you can really think about the balancing of the power of the voices from the research team compared to the community. Whose voices are informing your intervention, and how are you managing those things? Now say that you have some interventions. Nicole yesterday was saying, like, we know how to help people how to read. Say that you have an intervention. The problem now is then how to implement it. How do you develop strategies so then you can implement those interventions where people need? We have, sorry. It's less about, then the question here is less about what kind of intervention, but what kind of strategies are you using. And again, there are tons of methods that we can test here to increase trust, partnership, ownership, to build capacity, to engage in advocacy. And this slide has a different font and it's bold for two reasons. One is the field of implementation science in the context of school is new. I can cite names of people using that type of scholarship, right? Nicole being one of them. And so we need people like you to help us think through what kind of strategies do we need to test and engage in school settings. The second reason is there's a whole body of literature engaging in advocacy, in allyship, in anti-racism strategies that is really not coming and being explicit in the field of implementation science. And I would love to see more of that work coming to the field of implementation science in the field of school settings. So I urge you to help us, to engage with us, to engage with the field in helping promote equitable education. This is a paper by Larissa Gaius and others, again, trying to help us think about how can we make the assumptions of our strategies explicit. Because, for example, an education, me sitting down and teaching teachers how to teach, can be either an equitable strategy or not, depending on how I do it and who I am teaching and how I'm teaching. Develop the science of adaptation. Adaptation just happens. Way back when, in the field of mental health, at least that's my field, we used to complain about adaptation and have this, adaptation is bad, fidelity is good. This no longer is a question. Now we know that adaptation happens, and it makes a lot of sense, right? You don't brush your teeth the same way that I brush my teeth every single day. If you travel, for example, if I were there with you guys, I wouldn't be brushing my teeth in exactly the same hour. So adaptation just happens. It's life. Not only happens, but if we are to really achieve equity, it needs to happen. Many systematic reviews, literature reviews have shown the importance of adaptation if we are to engage historically underserved communities. So the problem now is not whether or not we need to adapt. The problem now is how to adapt and how to track those adaptations. And we've put forth several papers and frameworks and methodologies to help the field of the science of adaptation to track those things, with the goal of really understanding what is the relationship between the intervention and the strategies and the context, to help place those things in an equitable lens to improve our outcomes. So how are you planning adaptations? How are you tracking them? Who is informing them and why? Use an equity lens for implementation outcomes. What does that mean? It means that the same intervention, depending on how it is implemented, can actually be harmful to a community. So we need to really think about, when I say evidence-based intervention, there's a whole infrastructure behind that. So at the bottom line, when we think about what kind of intervention, what kind of strategies are needed, we really need to think about how to place things like cost, feasibility, fidelity in a flexible manner so as to embrace different contexts. What does that mean? It means that we need to be more explicit about the potential negative effects of our work. How are we observing, addressing, or not, and why not, systemic racism and discrimination in our work? Because it happens. So we need to start being more explicit about what it is that we're doing and why in the context of equity. This is the last slide, so you don't have to hear me coughing anymore. So if I were to really push the field and ask you, I would ask you to think about how can we achieve inclusion and representation in our trials, how we can reconfigure the intervention development and testing, how can we expand the science of adaptation and place equity at the center, and how can we invest our time, our effort in not only healthcare, I have healthcare here because that's the space that I tend to navigate, but school settings. I'm gonna say thank you. That's my email, my Twitter. Engage in the conversation, please. And I'm looking forward to this conversation with you.
All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. All right, wake up. Lunch. Good afternoon, everyone. All right, I'm Kim Yonneberg, and as Dr. Creasy mentioned, I am currently, I am currently a senior policy fellow for early literacy at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, otherwise known as Excel in Ed. It was founded by former Governor Jeb Bush after he left office here in Florida, and we focus a lot on policy advocacy issues. We're C3 and C4. And so we work with legislators on one hand who are looking to champion policies. And we have different policy areas, and early literacy is mine. And then on the other hand, I work with, I have a policy director, and we work directly with 28 states in DC on their implementation of these policies. So it's one thing to pass a policy. It's another thing to actually implement it and implement it with its intent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about equitable implementation. and how we were able to implement and continue to implement the Literacy-Based Promotion Act in Mississippi. In my former role, I was a state literacy director at the Mississippi DOE, as mentioned, and I led our initial implementation of the Literacy-Based Promotion Act from 2013 until 2019, which just so happened to be the span of time where we began to experience some success with early literacy, and not just in reading, but also in math during that time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we did that, but then also just the implications for how research informs policy and how we leverage research every day to make our case for ensuring that our children are just on the track to have a better quality of life. So we'll talk a little bit just briefly about why Read by 3 matters. You've heard a lot, I'm sure, about students who are learning to read kindergarten through 3rd grade, and then from there they are reading to learn. So I'll talk just a little bit about that. Also, the policy momentum across the country. This year alone, ExcelinEd worked with 15 states to either pass early literacy policy or strengthen language in their early literacy policies, or either protect their early literacy policy, because there's always someone who's looking to try to, you know, tear down what we've started, right? So you have to also work and advocate to protect certain things, right? Which is why implementation science is so important. If you're able to leverage that what we're doing is working, then it's a lot easier to protect that, to say, you know, there are people who want to see outcomes happen very quickly, and that doesn't always happen, so you have to stay the course. I'll talk about the Mississippi story, and then also how access and opportunities can lead to improved literacy outcomes for all students. I really like this quote. America's low literacy crisis is largely ignored. As we looked at the NAEP trend data, this has been happening forever. It's not just COVID, right? We were in a bad place before COVID hit. Historically underfunded. Now we have more funding in our schools than ever before in history, with all of the American Rescue Plan funds, our ESSER funds. But what are we going to do about that? So now we can no longer use funding as an excuse, right? Under-researched, woefully under-researched, and despite being one of the great solvable problems of our time. So I always tell people to find their people, right? And I am of the belief that illiteracy is one of the solvable problems of our time. And these are just some statistics, some of which you may have seen before, and I do have like some references at the bottom. 7 out of every 10 inmates cannot read above the 4th grade level. The Barbara Bush Family Foundation last year partnered with Gallup to look at the economic impact of illiteracy. And it says that the nation could be losing up to $2.2 trillion per year due to low adult literacy rates. As we also think about our subgroup population, students who are not reading proficiently in 3rd grade, this is of course the Annie Casey data, 4 times more likely not to graduate high school. If African American or Hispanic, 6 times more likely to drop out or fail to graduate from high school. And if low income minority, 8 times more likely to drop out or fail to graduate from high school. We also think about opportunities for quality of life, where people who are illiterate are unable to participate in the democratic process, which is especially very, very important, especially these days, right? To learn about how to take care of their families with health and all of these other disparities that plague many of our communities. One has to be, you know, very literate to be able to participate in society and to have the quality of life that they deserve. So we just have to ensure that we are doing our part to ensure that equity and access and opportunities are available for all. So let's talk a little bit about the science of reading and early literacy policy momentum. We'll just discuss a couple of terms. You know, former reading teacher, English teacher, so I like vocabulary. I mean, it's just what I like. All right, so the reading league, I believe it was last year, the National Reading League got together this coalition of like national researchers, practitioners, to come up with the defining guide for the science of reading. So really try to get a shared understanding of what the science of reading is. So it's an entire definition, right, that talks about how there's been so many decades of research. It ensures that we are, there's evidence that informs not only how proficient reading and writing develop, but also why some students have difficulty, and how we can most effectively assess and teach and therefore improve student outcomes through prevention and intervention for reading difficulties. We know that with the science of reading and the National Reading Counter Report, it's based on those 5 pillars of early literacy, including writing and all the things around reading, instruction, and of course, writing. But I also want to take a moment to talk about opportunity gap. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this is something that Anna mentioned in her presentation as well, as we talk about equity, the unequal or inequitable distribution of resources and opportunities. I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about the capacity and how we build capacity of those, especially our teachers and administrators who are in classrooms in schools every day, to equitably implement our laws and, you know, around the practices of teaching children how to read. So some students, they do not have ability gaps. They have opportunity gaps. And we have to be very real about that, right? There are some students that's just never been exposed, right? And if you expose them, they can get it. Okay, so the goal of reading, I'm sure you've seen this simple view of reading image. Almost everybody talks about reading, right? Well, this is really just a way to say, for those that are saying that the science of reading is just phonics, right? It's not just phonics. This is also a message that I always give to secondary teachers around the role of the science of reading and how children learn to read and what goes into that, what those components are. It's not just word recognition, you know, or decoding or phonics, but it's also language comprehension and how important it is for, you know, oral language and vocabulary across content areas, right? And all of that, of course, leads to reading comprehension. I also wanted to just really draw your attention to the ladder of reading and writing, and many of you know that it has been updated this year. The reason that I believe that this ladder has become so popular, and Nancy Young is actually working on a book with this, and I think that the reason it's become so popular is that it really looks at structured literacy in a way where we think about our classroom and what percentages of our students in our classroom may need the degree of instruction that is grounded in the science of reading and structured literacy. But I think it also addresses our students who need enrichment, and how we talk so much these days about interventions that sometimes we forget about our students who really need additional support. And how if we're teaching to the middle, you know, or we're really not ensuring that we're delivering what each child needs, that we can begin to kind of lose some of those students who really need opportunities for enrichment and for growth. Also recently, these last 2 columns, these 2 arrows were added. Data-based decision-making, how data and assessment also inform practice. And then linguistic processes, where we talk about the variations of language, right, including dialect, and how that also plays a role in how teachers perceive students' intelligence, right? But also how students begin to learn very early on with phonological awareness and phonics, right? That it has an impact, but we also have to acknowledge that so that we can address those things. Now, I'm a policy person, so I'm of course going to talk a little bit about this early literacy policy momentum. And these are my thoughts on why there's been such the forces behind this momentum with early literacy policy. A Science of Reading Resurgence, Emily Hanford, Hard Words, 2018, where were you, right? Do you remember? It's one of those things. Where were you when you heard Hard Words? I think the reason that this resonated with so many is because it brought the conversation around the science of reading to kitchen tables, to teachers, to parents and families. Whereas we talk a lot about it, I know at the state departments of education, or even administrators may talk about it, or superintendents may talk about it. But did parents really know that when their children were bringing home books and they were reading or looking as if, looking like they were reading or utilizing pictures, did they know that that was a bad thing? Or did they say, we have the same book for a week and my child has been able to read it all, right? Not thinking about how that child was reading, or if the child was reading accurately. So this entire series of Hard Words with Emily Hanford brought back, this discussion really to the forefront. And I know many of you have probably already heard Sold a Story, right? The 6-part series, which really calls out publishers for continuing to sell these resources that are not aligned to best practices. So a research around what the science of reading actually is with that conversation. NAEP 4th grade data, 2 decades of progress nearly gone. And I say progress, air quotes progress, right? Math and reading score hits historic lows. Dyslexia focused reform, if you don't know by now, Senator Cassidy, US Senator out of Louisiana, is really pushing for the 21st century, Dyslexia Act, making sure that we have more students who are identified and not just grouped under learning disabilities, making sure that they are identified with characteristics of dyslexia or dyslexia so that they can receive the support. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I chose these headlines for a reason. With the NAEP 4th grade reading data, it's filed under student achievement. With dyslexia focused reform, it's filed under politics. With the COVID-19 pandemic, it's filed under business, right? I'm a teacher, Nicole, I'm sorry. So let's stop for one moment. And let's talk about why that's relevant. Anyone, I can just take one person. Why is it relevant that these stories are all about education, but they're filed under different areas? Yes. It's not just the responsibility of educators, and it doesn't just impact our, the bottom line of graduating from high school, right? Our employers are seeing the impact of this. They are very concerned about where we are as a country and how well their future employees will be prepared to actually do the job, to do the thing, right? It's also playing a role in politics and the decisions that are being made. So I wanted to make sure that we stopped and made it a point to talk about how this is impacting everything that we do every day. It's not just an education issue. Okay, so when I talk about this comprehensive approach, how we're approaching literacy and early literacy, at Excel in Ed, we have what we call our fundamental principles of a comprehensive policy. How do we support our teachers and administrators? How do we support our parents and families? And of course, how are we supporting our students? So when you think about teachers, you think about training, making sure that they have the knowledge and skills to be able to teach students how to read. You think about coaches, how are they supported in the process of transferring theory to practice? Actually, in those classrooms, once I learn about the science of reading, how do I know that I'm doing it right? In my instructional practice. Also, with our educator preparation program coursework, trying to make sure that our faculty see themselves in K-12 student outcomes and that their reach does not just end when their candidates cross the stage. That however they were prepared, that's going to show up on day one when they get into classrooms with children. And then of course, funding to ensure that these components are able to be carried out, because there's nothing worse getting all these things, and then you have people that saying, well, this is an unfunded mandate. You want us to change our practices, but you didn't put any funding behind it. So it's very important for funding to be included. Assessment and parent notification, making sure that we identify kids early, as soon as kindergarten, through universal screeners, and of course, dyslexia screening notifications, notification for parents, making sure that they understand and that they know if their child has a reading deficiency. These are things that we can do at the school to support your child, and then these are things that you can do at home. It was hard to watch on social media during the pandemic. Parents just wanted anything, and there were horrible resources being shared, right? And so, oh, try this, try that. So parents just wanted something. So how can we ensure that in a very intentional way that we are providing parents with vetted resources so that they can support their children at home? And then, of course, with instruction and intervention, it's very important that once we arm teachers with this knowledge, that they actually have the materials that they need in the classroom that aligns with the science of reading to be able to teach and guide their instruction. Individual reading plans for students, making sure that you're monitoring their progress when you provide interventions, opportunities in the summer for targeted reading or math instruction, and parent resources. And then also, I know that Florida has, Mississippi also has, several other states have a promotion retention component to their law, where students are receiving an additional year of third grade, a different year with more intensive interventions. All right. So now that we have a baseline of what a comprehensive early literacy policy looks like, let's look at our landscape across the country. All right. For those states that are shaded in very dark, kind of burgundy, those states actually have a comprehensive K-3 policy. So all the things that I just listed, right? And as the shades get lighter, the adoption of these components, right, are fewer. And I want to make the note that just because these are present in law does not mean that they're being implemented effectively, right? So that's where you have this breakdown of this implementation gap. And that's why I really advocate now for, when I hear from legislators who want to champion, especially a literacy law, have you talk to the state education agency, because they're going to be the ones responsible for implementation or for guiding that implementation and for giving guidance to schools and districts about how these things are supposed to be done, right? So in 2022 alone, Alaska just passed an early literacy policy. Virginia, Delaware, we protected in Alabama, Missouri, Kentucky, right? So we were able to get some things passed in some states, and other states went all in and said, we want everything, right? After the vote happens, the real work starts with the implementation. Okay, so that's where we are as a country. So now let's talk about the Mississippi story. Our law is fashioned after Florida's, and as you know, when Governor Jeb Bush was governor in 2002, Florida adopted a comprehensive approach to early literacy, and they began to see some successes early on. So in 2013, Mississippi, our governor reached out to Governor Bush, who was at FCRR at the time, see how these stories come full circle, and said, we want to adopt the law here in Mississippi. Now, we had the support of what I call the big three. We had our governor's support, we had the support of our House and Ed chairs, House and Senate Ed chairs in our legislature, and then we also had the support of our state education agency to make this thing go, right? Any one of those things, if they're not in support of it, it's going to be very difficult, okay? So these are our implementation strategies, and these are the same components that I mentioned before in the fundamental principles of a comprehensive literacy component. We adopted all of those things, right? But what we also did was create an office that was specifically tasked, my office, that was specifically tasked with implementation. I talk about the biggest bang for our buck, and I think that our professional development, you always hear me say invest in people. Invest in people. because wherever you go, no one can take that away from you. Your knowledge, no one can take that away from you. And you will have to, on a dime, make decisions about how to address any types of issues that students are having, especially with struggling readers. You have to have that knowledge and know that for yourself. So our professional development, but also our literacy coaches. And we place our literacy coaches in our lowest performing schools by design. Okay, so with our literacy coach support, we had a multi-layered strategy. State literacy director had 4 state literacy coordinators, and Kristen Wynn is the current literacy director. We still have the same structure, right? She was one of my coaches when I started in 2013, and she transitioned. And as you think about sustainability, someone who started and now they're also the state literacy director, we were able to keep that thing moving, right? So state literacy director, state literacy coordinators who support regional coordinators throughout the state, and the regional coordinators who also coach in one school, then support our literacy coaches. So our coaches have coaches, right? Because we have to make sure that those who are supporting teachers on the ground also have a thought partner, also have someone that they can talk to about, well, these are some things that I'm trying, they're not necessarily working. Can you give me some additional strategies? In Mississippi, this last school year, there are 140 school districts and 470 elementary schools. So I want to just give you that framing. Okay. This was our deployment. Our state ed agency had always been looked upon as an auditing arm. You know, they talk about the State Department like as this big, like, oh my gosh, the State Department is coming to our school, like the whole State Department is coming, which usually meant that you did something wrong and they were coming to audit or, you know, state takeover, whatever that was. So a part of my role initially, because we were sending out literacy coaches from the state agency into schools, we had some schools that say, I don't want one. Like, I don't want coaches in my building. I don't want MDE in my building. But we really had to get buy-in. And we really had to message that our coaches are coming to support your schools and support your teachers, and they're non-evaluative, and they're really coming to help change instructional practice. When we began in 2013, 2014, we had about 28 districts. We had about 29 literacy coaches. We started off with 24 with the director included, and about 50 schools served. Now you wonder why that's such a low number. It's a low number because we could not find coaches who had the knowledge and skills that they needed in order to go into someone else's classroom to give them advice on how they could change their instructional practice. We just didn't. I mean, it was in the newspaper. It was, you know, they were looking for 75. They only got 24. Do you mean to tell us with all the national board certified teachers you couldn't find? And the answer was we couldn't find, right? And I talked earlier about, you know, Mississippi had always been at the bottom of every, you know, as it relates to education, we're always at the bottom. So it's really a no-brainer that we didn't have, you know, the people that we needed in order to fill these positions initially. So as you can see, it began to increase. We recruited every year, sometimes mid-year, we hired retirees. We did all of those things, and the more coaches we hired, the more schools we were able to serve. Again, very strategic and intentional about who we hired. We had to make sure that our coaches had the knowledge, but we also had to make sure that they were able to play well with adults, right? You have to be able to build relationships with adults if in any way you want to convince them that what you're advising them to do is the right thing. The relationship is key before they'll listen to anything you have to say, right? So we were looking for a couple of things. And I said in every interview, every year, because it was very important that we chose the right people. So as we rolled out letters training, as we had coaches in schools, we began to get better qualified candidates for coaches. And so we were able to increase our capacity for coaches and able to increase the number of schools that we were serving. And we began to have our high-rated, A-rated schools call to say, how can we get one of your literacy coaches? And I would say, well, your children would have to not do well, so you don't want to go that route. Then, you know, it was actually a suggestion of former Senator Tolleson at the time, who was a champion of the early literacy legislation, and said, well, why don't you all create modules? So if there are school districts who want to hire their own coaches, that they can go through the MDE literacy coach training, and you can multiply your efforts. Even though they don't have the MDE badge, they can also follow these same evidence-based practices. So that's what we began to do. And we began to offer training for those who had the title of literacy coach in their schools or in their districts to begin to multiply the efforts. All right, background information. So now, as you know, again, Mississippi is the poorest state in the nation. And they do talk about this Mississippi miracle that has happened. But, you know, I always say it was a slow climb. It was a slow climb because, again, a couple of things. We were putting boots on the ground. The State Department had never done that before. We were in your business, in your schools, working with teachers. We found out that a lot of administrators also needed help, right, in the elementary education space. And we were in some of the communities where they had not received a lot of help and guidance before, received a lot of money. Ironically, if you're not doing well, you get a lot of money from the feds. Like, you're always getting money, right? Because you're not doing well and you're in, you know, all of these designations. But I remember walking into a school and they had Promethean boards. Fancy, right, back in the day. But they did not receive the professional development to go along with, they did not purchase the professional development to go along with how to utilize those. And in some classrooms, they had chart paper, like sticky note chart paper, over the Promethean boards, right? So again, you can put a lot of stuff, you know, in these schools, but when you increase knowledge and invest in people, then that's where the rubber meets the road. Okay, so how providing access to teachers who are trained in the science of reading, literacy coaches, interventions for students that are required, parental notification that's required, summer reading opportunities, access to all of those things. Because again, these things were happening in some places. I mean, we have some pretty good districts in Mississippi or schools. They're happening in some places. The problem was that they weren't happening everywhere. Every child didn't have access to these things. So I want to do a little comparison here. And I'm going to use West Virginia. And I'm using West Virginia because out of the 40 states jurisdictions that could report out on Black subgroup data for fourth grade reading NAEP, West Virginia is now 40th. It was Wisconsin in 2019. They were 42nd out of 42. And I'm also using West Virginia because Florida adopted its comprehensive early literacy policy in 2002. Mississippi adopted a comprehensive early literacy policy in 2013. West Virginia adopted some components, minimal components of an early literacy policy, but were also very general on the guidance. An example would be if you say that students must be screened kindergarten through third grade, but you don't say that the universal screener must assess for certain components, and that the universal screener should be administered 3 times per year, right? So we get what we're saying about very general, as opposed to a law being very specific as to this is the floor, like this is the framework of what should happen. Okay, so that's why I'm doing that. Also want you to take a look at the student population. West Virginia's Hispanic population, they did not have enough in order to be included in the following slides. But West Virginia, you know, a little bit more than half of Mississippi's student population, and then of course Florida with all the kids, right? All the students in Florida. But also look at per pupil expenditure. So take a moment and think about that. Think about the per pupil expenditure, you know, as a state, how much are we spending on our students per pupil? And if we want to say that it's all about funding, then if it is just about funding and not implementation, then we would see some better results. Okay. So for West Virginia, all students ranked 49th. This is 4th grade. White students ranked 51st. And there is a wasp or something in here. I see it, y'all. I'm multitasking over here. Black students ranked 40th. Free and reduced lunch students ranked 47th. Now, something that's important to know, the gap between white and Black students is 9 scale score points. So, you know, we always say you can make data say whatever you want. Oh my gosh, we're closing the achievement gap between whites and Blacks, but you're not. What's happening? Yeah, but in this case, what's happening? White students are performing as well as they. So the white students are going down, right? So, you know, we can no longer, you know, tell how well we're doing by how well our white kids are doing, right? So the white student, their gains have decreased. Their improvement, you know, of course, has decreased, which makes it closer to the Black students, right? So there's a problem. There's a problem there. So let's talk a little bit about the data. As you can see, West Virginia is in green, Florida is in blue, Mississippi is in red, and the gray is the national public average. Now, this is for all students. In 2002, 4th graders in West Virginia outperformed their peers nationally and in Mississippi by 16 scale score points 2 decades ago, which translates into over 1.5 grade levels. By 2022, West Virginia is outperformed by Mississippi and perform a full grade level below the national average. Now, when you begin to look at these trend lines, remember, Florida adopted their literacy policy in 2002. Mississippi adopted its literacy policy in 2013, and they both had offices that were there to support. Florida Center for Reading Research came about during that same time, right? Rail Southeast, all of these other support structures and intentional implementation supports, right? And West Virginia actually adopted, again, their policy, it's in some of those principles around 2014. Okay, so what has happened? You saw some gains happening around 2017, and then 2019 and 2022, it just tanked. So there are some questions around what was actually happening in West Virginia during that time for their scores to go that low, right? So let's look under the hood. Subgroup data for white students from West Virginia. And I'll just give you a moment to look at these slides, and I want you to know anything that stands out to you. You kind of see the same trend, right? I really want to know what happened after 2017, right? Y'all want to know that too? I really want to know what happened then. And as you can see with Mississippi, we were beginning to see some gains, some consistent gains beginning in 2015. And we were able to hold our own with white students there. Okay, Black students. Somebody talk to me. Tell me what you see. All over the place. But tell me what you see. Anyone? Looks like they began making efforts. In 2015 was the highest at 210, and they were not sustained. I also want to talk about the fact that West Virginia's population of Black students is only 4%. Okay, we'll go back. Important to know, Black population in West Virginia, 4%, Florida, 22%, Mississippi, 48%. almost half. Okay. All right. And now we're talking about our economically disadvantaged students here. In 2002, economically disadvantaged fourth graders in West Virginia outperformed their Mississippi peers by 1.5 full grade levels. But by 2022, they were performing more than 1.5 grade levels worse and lagging the national average by nearly a grade level. All right, so when you look at this type of data and these types of trend lines, and we talk about researchers and your role, just really want to connect it to your roles. There are so many implications for research and for trying to figure out what was happening and why, who was in leadership, because leadership matters, what were their priorities. You know, sometimes we take our eyes off the ball, right? And then those are the things that, you know, they said, you know, inspect what you expect, and what gets measured gets done. Oh, you've heard that, what gets measured gets done, right? So you have to think about what was happening during those times where they began to experience some success, and then all of a sudden, and it seems all of a sudden to us, but there was really a decline in student performance on that. Okay, so what were our lessons learned? You know, as we think about our trend, especially in Mississippi, and we saw that, you know, hey, we can actually do this thing. You know, I was telling people, you know, the group earlier, you know, once you see some success, you can't unsee that. Right? It builds this sense of pride. And I tell Stacey, yeah, we heard y'all say, thank God for Mississippi. We heard you, we know who you are. But, you know, it builds a sense of it can be done. These things that are unprecedented, that haven't been done before, once you can do those things, then you really do have something to fight for, right? You want to make sure that you are doing the right thing by all kids. So, lessons learned: develop clear guidance for strategic and equitable implementation. A lot of what we did had to do with resources going out across the state to parents, talking to parents about what they needed to know, how this law impacted them, and what were some things that they needed to look for and expect from the schools and districts. Be transparent in communication with stakeholders, even if you don't know the answers. Because the more you send people to someone else, you know, hey, please hold, let me send you to this other department. It's like, I don't know, please hold, let me see. Before you, the more you do that, the more frustrated stakeholders are with the process. They want to know. Even if your answer is to say, we don't know yet, right? Pick up the phone, making sure that you are transparent in your communication. Adopt a model for your literacy staff or any types of boots on the ground deployment and coaching practices. Measure and monitor your progress. So the first one was more qualitative about our Literacy-Based Promotion Act, where we wanted to make sure that we kept getting things out to our stakeholders. The second one, we were fortunate enough to partner with Rail Southeast, and of course, Florida Center for Reading Research has supported us throughout this entire process to release this study about the educator outcomes associated with our professional development model and also our coaching model. And then the last one really looked at some stakeholder input around whether they felt that they were more informed about what we had going on in the state. It was very favorable in the surveys that they had for our parents and students. And so lastly, I'll just talk about very briefly the study that we were able to work with RAIL. There were 2 instruments that were developed specifically for this study. We now use those, the Teacher Knowledge of Early Literacy Skills Survey with 2 states, with North Carolina, and they were able to leverage their results for legislation, and also most recently in Indiana, and those results are on our website. And the other one is the Coaches Classroom Observation Tool, where our coaches were trained in an observation tool to literally look at every bit of instructional practice that the teachers were practicing as they were delivering instruction, and to code what that looked like. So these instruments are in the appendix of this study. Findings. This was about 4 administrations, like between 2014 and 2015. So between the spring of 2014 and 2015, We looked at the average teacher knowledge of early literacy skills, and we looked at it related to where teachers were in their knowledge and in their letters training, language essentials for teachers of reading and spelling, where they were in their professional development. Either they had not had it at all, they had possibly one phase of it, or they had completed the training, right? So we looked at how did their knowledge increase on this particular survey, depending on where they were in the training. There was an increase from the 48th to the 59th percentile for increasing teachers' knowledge. So now the increase in teacher knowledge of early literacy skills was associated with progress in the professional development program. So it goes into specifically where educators were in their program and how that kind of correlated with their knowledge. So educators who had not started the program were in the 54th percentile, whereas educators who had completed it were in the 65th percentile. Imagine being able to take a report like this to your legislative body who's actually funding your work to say, here is a return on your investment, right? So the other two findings, our target schools where our coaches were in there actually recording teacher instruction from their laptop and coding, and we sent all of the data to Rail Southeast for them to put it together in a report. It showed that the quality of instruction in the classroom increased from the 31st percentile to the 58th percentile. The average rating of student engagement increased from 37th to 53rd, and the average rating of teaching competencies increased from 30th to 44th percentile, right? And then lastly, there was an increase in the average ratings of quality of instruction, student engagement. It goes on to talk about the higher quality of instruction. It goes into those specific components there. And lastly, it is going to take an interconnected system from policy to practice in order to make this thing work. Our state legislature, our departments of education, our colleges of education, district and district superintendents and leaders, our administrators and our teachers, and of course, our parents and families and our students. So thank you for your time.